Bully Pulpit, Confronting the Problem of Spiritual Abuse in the Church by Michael J. Kruger. Copyright 2022. Chapter 5, Flipping the Script. The Retaliatory Tactics of Abusive Leaders. Evil always wins through the strength of its splendid dupes, and there has in all ages been a disastrous alliance between abnormal innocence and abnormal sin. G.K. Chesterton. In April 2018, Bill Hybels, senior pastor of one of the most iconic and successful churches in the United States, Willow Creek Community Church, announced that he would be stepping down after 42 years in ministry. By many standards, his ministry had been a smashing success. Willow Creek drew nearly 25,000 worshipers each week to the main campus and 7 satellite campuses. It was a model to thousands of other churches across the world of how to effectively reach the lost by building a worship experience that was friendly and welcoming to non-Christians. It seemed Hybels would ride off into the sunset, having accomplished amazing things for the kingdom of God. Unbeknownst to the congregation at the time, allegations began to surface as far back as 2014 that Hybels for many years had engaged in inappropriate sexual relationships with women in his church, including employees. While the elders of the church had conducted their own investigation and determined that he had done nothing wrong, Hybels had supposedly been cleared, the allegations had not gone away. So, in an apparent effort to get ahead of the story, Hybels finally spoke publicly to the Chicago Tribune. According to the Tribune, Hybels flatly denied all the charges, claiming that former staff and church members were lying and had inexplicably colluded against him. This has been a calculated and continual attack on our elders and on me for 4 long years. I want to speak to all the people around the country that have been misled for the past 4 years and tell them in my own voice, in as strong a voice as you'll allow me to tell it, that the charges against me are false. There still to this day is not evidence of misconduct on my part." End quote. Beyond this statement to the press, Hybels also publicly denied the charges at a family meeting of his own congregation, a denial that was met with a standing ovation. Despite Hybels' attempt to control the narrative, 1 year later a robust third-party investigation concluded that these women had been telling the truth all along. And it wasn't just sexual abuse that was in play. The report also indicated spiritual abuse, as Hybels was said to have a pattern of intimidating and verbally attacking members of the church staff. If anyone disagreed with him, he would power up. So definitive was the reversal that the entire elder board of Willow Creek eventually resigned as well. This entire case, as tragic as it is, highlights a sobering reality. Abusive leaders employ aggressive and well-orchestrated tactics to keep from being discovered. These tactics are so common in cases across the country that it almost seems as if the abusive pastors are reading from the same playbook. Hybels engaged in some of the most common of these tactics, including profuse denials, rallying a group of defenders, attacking the accusers, and making himself out to be the victim of a conspiratorial plot to ruin his good name. In short, abusive pastors try to defend themselves by flipping the script. Unfortunately, these tactics work. The purpose of this chapter is to help churches understand these tactics so they can be identified and addressed. Here are the most common defensive tactics of abusive leaders. Build a coalition of defenders. An abusive pastor's first step is to build a strong coalition of allies who can speak up for him, defend him, and even go on the offensive against the victims. This coalition effectively becomes the abusive pastor's team of lawyers, committed to defending him at all costs. The building of the coalition doesn't usually begin the moment accusations are made. Most abusive pastors have been doing this for years, forging relationships in the leadership board in case a situation like this might arise. While it's perfectly normal behavior for the senior pastor to have close relationships with other elders, those closer relationships are often used as protection from accountability in cases of spiritual abuse. As soon as accusations come to light, the behind-the-scenes networking begins, as he weaves his own narrative about what happened. By the time the victims tell their story to a committee, the abusive pastor has already turned most of the elders against them. This is why many victims opt to leave. Since the pastor has controlled the narrative, they realize there's no hope of overcoming the abusive pastor's tactics. An abuse survivor tells his story. At first I tried to confront the abusive person. After that didn't work out, it was too late to share with my friends because he beat me to all of them and told them not to talk to me, to not return my texts, calls, or emails. Since loyalty to him was what he enforced, not even my closest friends would talk to me. I was cut off instantly." End quote. An abusive pastor's ability to build a coalition of defenders goes beyond his personal relationships with these people. It is also because he is asking them to do something that is more psychologically natural to them. Generally speaking, people prefer to act as defenders rather than accusers, especially in a Christian context and especially on behalf of a pastor. Thus, most elders or church members quickly become aggressive defenders of the pastor, even lobbying others to join the cause, while very few become advocates for the victims. After all, the latter requires them to accuse the pastor, whom God supposedly called to be a leader. And that is difficult for most people to do. Defending is heroic. Accusing is risky. This entire scenario reminds us again that the problem with spiritual abuse in the church goes well beyond the individual abusive pastor. Spiritual abuse is allowed to continue because willing supporters protect and enable that pastor. Insist proper process wasn't followed. In the 1997 political film Wag the Dog, the spin doctor Conrad Brian, played by Robert De Niro, describes the most important factor when controlling a narrative. Quote, "To change the story, change the lead." End quote. In other words, make the main issue something other than the alleged crime that was committed. This is a move designed to flip the script. For defense attorneys wanting to deflect attention from the guilt of their client, this is critical advice. And one of the most common legal tactics designed to change the lead is to file numerous procedural objections. There was no search warrant. No Miranda rights were given. The jury did not receive proper instructions. Before long, the conversation has ceased to be about the crime and is now about the procedure, which is exactly what the defendant wants. It's no different in abuse cases in the church. Abusive pastors often deflect attention off what they've done by issuing loud complaints that proper procedures weren't followed. So loudly do they object that they begin to look like the victims, and the abused individuals appear to be the real perpetrators. In a number of cases I studied, it was not unusual for procedural issues to become so central that the abuse itself was nearly forgotten. People were upset, but not at the pastor's abusive behavior. Instead, they were upset about how certain procedural steps weren't followed during his prosecution. In their minds, it was the abusive pastor who had been mistreated. He was the real victim. Often these same people expressed little concern over how the victims had been treated. Certainly, an accurate and fair judicial process does matter, just like in the secular courts. In any case where a person is accused, we have to make sure they are treated fairly and impartially. But we should be concerned if procedural issues become so central that the pastoral abuse itself is forgotten. Of all the procedural objections, one is trumpeted louder than any other. The victims didn't follow Matthew 18. So let's address that objection more fully. Here is the passage in full. "If your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have gained your brother. But if he does not listen, take one or two others along with you, that every charge may be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector." Matthew 18, 15 through 17. While Matthew 18 is a very important passage for dealing with sins in the congregation, it isn't exhaustive. It is not meant to address or solve every possible scenario. Unfortunately, sometimes it is treated like a universal cure that can be applied to every situation. Here are several important clarifications that prove to be especially relevant to abuse cases. First, we must remember that Matthew 18 applies only to individuals who have been sinned against. It doesn't just say, if your brother sins. It says, if your brother sins against you. Thus, the passage doesn't apply to every situation where one person might accuse another of sin. For example, if a member of a church staff has watched a pastor abuse other members of the staff, they are not obligated to go to that pastor directly. They can go straight to the elder board and report the bad behavior. In fact, 1 Timothy 5:19, "Do not admit a charge against an elder except on the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses," implies that such charges against an elder can be brought directly to church leadership. Abusive pastors are understandably eager to block this sort of complaint from ever making it to the elder board. So the pastor's defenders, or the pastor himself, will often rebuke the accuser by saying something like, "Why didn't you go to the pastor first, as Matthew 18 requires?" The problem is that Matthew 18 doesn't apply in this case. Notably, just a few verses later, Jesus gives a positive example of direct reporting when one person sins against another. The unmerciful servant mistreating someone who owes him money. Matthew 18:21-35. When the other servants notice his bad behavior, they don't confront him directly. Instead, the text says they went and reported to their master all that had taken place. The master did not say, "Well, have you confronted the unmerciful servant yourself?" No, in this case, that rule does not apply. Second, even if the accuser should have followed Matthew 18 but failed to do so, that does not mean that the elder board or other governing body should overlook the sins of the abusive pastor. Some abusive pastors treat Matthew 18 like Miranda rights. If the technical procedures aren't followed, they are unable to be prosecuted for the crime. But failing to follow Matthew 18 does not give someone a get-out-of-jail-free card. The church should still hold the pastor accountable for his abusive actions, even if the accuser did not follow the right steps. Sure, the accuser's failure to follow Matthew 18 should be addressed too, but there should be no attempt to make the two issues equally problematic, as if failing to follow Matthew 18 is equivalent to being an abusive shepherd. Third, even if the accuser follows Matthew 18 and the abusive pastor admits some wrongdoing, that does not necessarily mean the behavior should not be reported to the church's leadership. Some pastors want their victims to follow Matthew 18 so they can resolve this issue through a quick apology and move on without anyone else knowing. In other words, abusive pastors sometimes use Matthew 18 as a method of silencing the victims and keeping their track record of conflict under wraps. But some behaviors are indeed serious enough that a member is justified in reporting it to the larger leadership body, even if the abusive pastor seems apologetic about it. Certainly this includes blatant criminal behaviors where law enforcement needs to be involved, but a case can be made that a member could justifiably report spiritually abusive behavior too. Verbal attacks, berating or humiliating a church member, threatening to fire an employee, and more. Bringing such behavior to the attention of those who are responsible for the oversight of that pastor's ministry does not violate Matthew 18. Fourth, some abuse cases are so severe that making the victim confront the abusive pastor privately would be irresponsible. For instance, if a pastor sexually groped a staff member, it would be, in the words of McKnight and Barringer, inexcusable and psychologically violent to insist that the victim meet with the perpetrator one-on-one. Indeed, no godly husband, having found out what happened to his wife, would force her back into the room alone with such a person under the pretenses of Matthew 18. Yet in the case of Bill Hybels, the female victims were scolded for not following Matthew 18 and meeting with Bill Hybels privately. Could those same concerns apply to certain cases of spiritual abuse? I think so. Again, one could understand how a husband might rightly refuse to allow his wife to meet alone with a pastor who had verbally intimidated and attacked her. As Lisa Oakley, an expert in spiritual abuse, has argued regarding Matthew 18, when we get into a situation of spiritual abuse, there's a mismatch of power. And actually trying to get people together in a room at the beginning is not something you would do with other forms of abuse. End quote. While the lines aren't always clear, and there are inevitable gray areas that can be debated, we should remember that Matthew 18 is not a catch-all passage that applies to every conceivable scenario. Here's the point. If a pastor is accused of abusive behavior, be wary if procedural issues become the biggest concern of all those involved. Claim to be the victim of slander. If a pastor is accused of spiritual abuse, it would not be surprising, nor would it be inappropriate, for him to declare his innocence. He might, in fact, be innocent, but it is wholly different for that pastor to declare that he's been slandered. That is more than a claim of innocence. It is an aggressive countercharge that the accusers themselves are engaged in despicable and sinful behavior. It's a way to present himself as the victim and the accusers as the problem. In other words, it's a methodology designed to flip the script. The counterclaims of slander or gossip are all too common in cases of spiritual abuse, Time and again, abusive pastors argue that they are the victims of a conspiratorial plot against them, as their enemies have colluded to smear their good name. As noted, Hybels made this very claim in his Chicago Tribune interview. Mike Cosper, in his podcast The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, noticed the same trend. Quote, "There's a clear pattern in churches in conflict where leaders who want to quell the conflict address it by calling it all gossip and labeling those who are sharing their stories as divisive or wolves." End quote. Abusive leaders also use the category of slander to their advantage in another way. Some churches and organizations develop an environment where anyone who speaks negatively about the leader will be accused of slander. In other words, these groups silence people by threatening them, either explicitly or implicitly, with potential charges of slander. This aggressive posture creates a ministry culture where people live in fear. If they ever speak up, they will be castigated, charged, or fired. When one of Ravi Zacharias' team members spoke up about Zacharias' troubling behavior, that individual was reprimanded for spreading rumors. This fear keeps people quiet. In several spiritual abuse cases I studied, an abusive pastor mistreated staff members, even for many years. Yet they never knew that other staff members were experiencing the same treatment. Everyone assumed their situation was an isolated case. The reason for this silence became clear. If they spoke negatively about the senior pastor to another member of staff, they knew that they could be accused of slander and probably fired. So out of fear, they all remained quiet. This allowed the abuse to continue unchecked for years. How can churches or Christian organizations avoid creating a culture where people are afraid to speak up? First, they need to make sure that they have the correct definition of slander. While the term is frequently used, it is often misunderstood. Slander is not merely saying something negative about another person. It is saying something negative while knowing it is false, or at least having no basis to think it's true. In other words, slander involves malicious intent to harm another's reputation by spreading lies about them. See 2 Samuel 10:3, 1 Kings 21:13, Proverbs 6:16-19, Proverbs 16:28, and Psalm 50:19-20. Here we should pause to emphasize that slander is a very serious sin. To lie about another person is something the Lord hates, Proverbs 6:16. Such lies can destroy a person's reputation and ministry. But telling the truth is not slander. To speak up about a pastor's abusive behavior in appropriate ways is not slander. There is a rich irony, then, when the accused pastor offers a strong countercharge of slander. If he has no evidence that the accuser is lying, the pastor himself is guilty of slander. In other words, the pastor expressing concern over unjust accusations may be making an unjust accusation against someone else in the process. And when the pastor's defenders repeat the claim that he is a victim of slander, without any evidence that the accusers have malicious intent, they too may be guilty of slander. Now, one might wonder what it means if there is an ecclesiastical investigation and the abusive pastor is acquitted. Does that suddenly make the original charges slanderous? Not at all. We've already noted how difficult it can be to convict a pastor of spiritual abuse. All the odds are stacked against it. After all, the initial investigations of Steve Timmis, James McDonald, and Bill Hybels all resulted in some form of exoneration. So an acquittal does not necessarily prove that the original charges were mistaken. It may just mean that there wasn't enough explicit evidence, or perhaps that the investigative body was unable to condemn one of their own. Either way, if the victim came forward in good faith about their concerns, then no slander was involved. Just a quick word about gossip, which is a close cousin to slander. The two are similar in that they both involve negative reports. But whereas slander is false, gossip may be true. The problem with gossip is not necessarily that it's false information, but that it's information shared with malicious intent, namely to harm a person's reputation or to entertain or titillate others. Gossip also is a serious sin that churches should address, but we must remember that not all negative reports are gossip. A person may share a negative report about someone without malicious intent. Indeed, victims of abuse may share their story with others for many legitimate reasons, to get advice on how to proceed, to get counseling and encouragement for what they've endured, or to warn others about the pastor's bad behavior. This last reason is particularly noteworthy. One might even say that a church member has a moral obligation to speak up about a pastor's bad behavior to protect other church members from being harmed. Paul seems to act in this way when he warns others about the bad behavior of Alexander the coppersmith. Beware of him yourself, for he strongly opposed our message. 2 Timothy 4:15. Second, in addition to understanding the definition of slander, churches need to avoid creating a culture of fear around slander by addressing, honestly and fairly, the likelihood of false accusations of abuse against a pastor. In some churches, members are viewed with a spirit of suspicion, as if they are always on the verge of lying or making false accusations against the leadership. The biggest fear is not that church members will be abused, but that a pastor will be abused. Thus, when people step forward with concerns, there's a built-in disposition that these folks are probably lying, and that the pastor needs to be trusted and defended. But churches need to consider whether this built-in disposition is justified. Is there an epidemic of false abuse accusations against pastors? Do statistics show that church members are prone to lie about abuse? All the indicators we have suggest that the answer is no. While there are no hard statistics on spiritual abuse accusations, the percentage of false accusations in cases of sexual abuse hovers somewhere between 2% and 7%. And given that most abuse cases are not reported, the actual percentage is probably lower still. If there is a parallel with spiritual abuse, and the two forms of abuse are often linked, then we have little reason to think false accusations are a statistically significant problem. Churches also need to consider the enormous price that people pay when they come forward and speak up about spiritual abuse. Typically, they are not believed. They have their character attacked and tarnished, and they are driven out of churches they love. See chapter 6 for examples. What would motivate them to lie about the charges? What would they have to gain? Often they have everything to lose. This doesn't mean people never lie about whether pastors are abusive. Of course they do, and when it does happen, it should be taken very, very seriously. But we should not assume that an accuser is lying. Now, one might argue that there are other types of false accusations besides lying. Even if the accusers aren't lying, they might still be mistaken about their claims. They might think they suffered abuse when they really didn't. They may just have an overly sensitive personality that leads them to exaggerate what happened. They just blew it out of proportion. Fair enough. This important possibility has to be considered, and is all the more reason for an independent third-party investigation. More on that in chapter 7. In the meantime, there is one factor that can help clear up questions about whether an accuser has made a mountain out of a molehill. Has more than one accuser come forward? If multiple people have stepped forward with similar stories and claims, then their credibility goes up considerably. It is hard to imagine that all these people share the same proclivity to exaggerate and see something that isn't there. Is that possible? Sure, it's possible. But is it likely? In most cases, it is not. Sadly, even when multiple witnesses come forward, that doesn't necessarily mean they're believed. In numerous cases I studied, multiple witnesses told the same story of bullying and intimidation. Even so, the church's leadership board did not believe these testimonies. These cases demonstrate again how difficult it is to prosecute spiritual abuse. Attack the character of the victims. During Harvey Weinstein's 2020 sexual assault trial, the aggressive tactics of his Rottweiler lawyer, Donna Rotuno, quickly became the focus of the media reports. Rather than defending Weinstein as a good and decent man who could never have done these things, she adopted an old-school scorched earth approach: destroy the character of the victims. During the 7-week-long trial, her strategy was to present the victims as opportunistic manipulators who used sex with Weinstein to boost their careers. She cross-examined one poor witness for 9 hours, regularly causing her to sob uncontrollably on the stand. Her message was simple: the witnesses were the real perpetrators, not Weinstein. This same defensive tactic is one of the most common in spiritual abuse cases, and abusive pastors often have their own team of lawyers who are more than willing to go along with it. In case after case, abusive leaders shift the attention to all the character flaws or behavioral problems in their accusers. In other words, it is a tactic designed to flip the script. and it works. The reason abuse victims are often scared to come forward is because they've seen what happens to those who do. They can see that those who've spoken up in the past have had their lives destroyed, and they don't want to end up like them. This character attack on the victims happens in a number of ways. First, the abusive pastor might bring up the past sins of the victims. Since everyone is a sinner, it should be no surprise that the victims of abuse sin. And because the abusive pastor has usually had a long relationship with the victims, he is all too familiar with their sin patterns. Beyond this, as noted in Chapter 2, abusive churches often pressure their members to openly confess their darkest sins. So the abusive leader is well positioned to retaliate by dredging up all the issues in the lives of the witnesses. As we also noted in Chapter 2, there are reasons to doubt the abusive pastor's claims about the sins of the victims. Often the abusive pastor is wrong about a person's sins, or at least exaggerates them. Regardless, the tactic still works. For fear of having their own sins put on display, many victims avoid coming forward at all. Usually they just leave the church, hoping to avoid the embarrassment that would be caused by the retaliatory wrath of an angry senior pastor. Second, in addition to highlighting past sins, the abusive pastor might attack the way the victims are handling the conflict. He might weave a narrative that paints victims as unforgiving, angry, hard-hearted, and unwilling to reconcile, all while painting himself as a peacemaker who has reached out with an olive branch that has been repeatedly rejected. Several factors are overlooked in such a narrative. For one, when people are mistreated and abused, they may lash out or be angry. Yes, this behavior may be sinful, but that does not negate the pastor's abuse or absolve him of blame. If a bully picks on a kid at school for months and months, and that kid eventually retaliates, the blame for the whole affair doesn't suddenly shift. The bully is still responsible for the months of abusive behavior. Here's where the church needs to be very careful. Because of what the victim has been through, it is often the case that the victim appears uncooperative, mistrusting, fearful, angry, and hard-hearted. Meanwhile, the abusive leader, at least outwardly, often appears to be cooperative and conciliatory as he engages with the process. Indeed, he seems to get it and is working hard to change. The danger here is that it can begin to look like the abuser is the good guy and the victim is the bad guy. And this often leads to tragic results. Church support and pastoral care rallies around the abuser, who appears to be working so hard to reconcile. But prior studies on abuse have shown that this outward perception of the abuser and the victim is only that, an outward perception. Once the abusive leader is confronted over his sinful actions and called to repentance, it's often the case that his cooperative spirit will quickly disappear, and he will begin to lash out at those holding him accountable. Moreover, as the victims are given time and space to heal and recover, it's often the case that their defensive walls come down and they begin to trust again. In other words, the abusive leader is happy to offer an olive branch as long as he never has to admit any real wrongdoing. Like Saruman in The Lord of the Rings, he won't repent of his actions, but still insists on brokering peace with the victims. As noted in the prior chapter, this allows him to look like the better man who's wanting to reconcile, while never owning the deep damage he's done. Third, sometimes victims are accused of having a victimhood mentality. In a number of testimonies I read, the victims were portrayed as too easily offended and bothered by the legitimate expressions of pastoral authority. This type of claim will play well in certain churches that are irritated as what they see the victimhood mentality prevalent in our broader culture. For these churches, the problem isn't the bully pastor, but the progressive church members who are overly sensitive. Closely related to this sort of tactic is the additional claim that you can't trust the testimony of these victims because their experience probably clouds their judgment. They're just too close to it all, it's argued. They're overly emotional and therefore unreliable. This tactic is often used if the victim coming forward is a woman. It's all too easy for an abusive pastor to convince a room of his fellow all-male elders that a woman cannot be trusted because she, like all women, is too sensitive and therefore unreliable. Unlike him, of course. Aside from the profound lack of charity and compassion in such a response, not to mention the demeaning way it portrays women, it also has logical flaws. For one, why is it that victims of abuse are the only ones whose personal experience affects their judgment? Does the personal experience of the church elders not affect their judgment? Couldn't a positive personal experience make it harder to spot abuse, or lead one to believe that it's exceptionally unlikely? And couldn't their friendship with the senior pastor also affect their judgment? Also, we would never apply this argument to other spheres of life. What if we discounted the incredible testimony of Harriet Tubman about the abuse that she and others suffered as slaves, because we insisted that her experience must have clouded her judgment? Would we really suggest that she was prone to exaggeration because she was too close to it all, and therefore overly emotional? Probably because she was a woman. I hope not. Fourth, it's not unusual for an abusive pastor to fabricate claims against the victims to make himself look better. In testimonies I read from a church in the Southwest, an abusive pastor, to defend himself from an investigation, spread lies against an elder and his wife, telling members that they were trying to run him off so their son could become the new pastor. There was no evidence for such claims. They were completely fabricated. I wish that such outright lies in abuse cases were rare, but I have seen this behavior in story after story. These tactics to malign the character of the victims are deeply disturbing, but they are used because they work. The tragedy is that some churches have allowed these sort of counter-accusations to be leveled against abuse victims, leaving them exposed and unprotected. That should occasion some serious soul-searching for anyone in Christian leadership. Tout your own character and accomplishments. Not only is the abusive leader quite likely to attack the character of the victims, but he also attempts to bolster his own character and accomplishments. At this point, appeals are made to everything this individual has done to bless the church. He has labored faithfully for 20 years. He has planted many other churches. He has mentored countless young pastors. He has been a faithful member of his denomination, etc. In short, abusive pastors want to put their carefully edited resume on display. One feature of this tactic is for the abusive pastor to get character references. He or his supporters might organize a campaign to collect written statements from all sorts of people he's blessed over the years, explaining what a wonderful, kind, and generous pastor he's been, how he helped them through a tough time, gave them good advice, or was a particularly caring shepherd. All this evidence is designed to create cognitive dissonance in the minds of the elder board or other adjudicating body. How can a man who's accomplished so much good for the kingdom, or has helped so many people, be the same kind of man who would mistreat and bully members of his church? To resolve this cognitive dissonance, people default to assuming the charges can't possibly be true. This is another way abusive pastors flip the script. They convince people that they, not the victims, are the trustworthy ones. Most churches don't realize that ministry accomplishments and character references are not determining factors in whether a pastor is abusive. Virtually any Christian leader who's been in ministry for a decent length of time could trumpet his accomplishments and find people who've been blessed by his ministry. Indeed, how many local pastors could go toe-to-toe with the accomplishments of someone like Ravi Zacharias, or Bill Hybels, or Mark Driscoll? And yet they were all perpetrators of abuse. As noted in Chapter 4, abusive pastors have two sides. One side is often warm, caring, and endearing. The other is harsh, cold, and cruel. Most people have only seen the good side of the abusive pastor, so it would not at all be surprising that such an individual might have a plentiful supply of character references. But this does not mean that he is not abusive. Play the sympathy card. Even though victims of spiritual abuse have suffered greatly, more on this in the next chapter, one tactic of abusive leaders is to talk about how much they've suffered. They will go to great lengths to describe how much pain they're in because of the unresolved conflict with those accusing them. They will tell how they have lost sleep, been racked with anxiety, and are deeply saddened by the whole affair. Even Saruman wanted to talk about the injuries that have been done to me. This move is designed to engender sympathy, not for the victims, but for the abuser. Again, it is designed to flip the script. To produce even more sympathy, some abusive leaders then appeal to how the whole situation has affected their spouse or their family. They might point out how much their wife has suffered or how their kids are broken-hearted and disillusioned. This tactic is effective precisely because we ought to feel sympathy for the family members harmed by the scandal. Often the spouses and children are unaware of how the pastor has mistreated others, though some spouses enable and defend their husband's abusive behavior and sometimes even participate in his deceptions. Indeed, some church courts feel less inclined to prosecute such a pastor because they feel sorry for his family, which has suffered enough. But sympathy for the family should not lessen the need to hold the abusive pastor accountable. It is his behavior, not that of the victims, that brought pain to his own family. Instead of blaming others, he should take responsibility for his own actions. Conclusion. As varied as spiritual abuse cases can be, abusive leaders often follow the same well-organized playbook to defend themselves. The purpose of this chapter has been to describe and respond to each step in that playbook so that churches are better equipped to protect their congregations, particularly the victims who have the courage to step forward and tell their stories. Unfortunately, not all churches understand the tactics we discussed, and therefore many victims remain unprotected. Not only are they abused by their pastors, but then in turn they are not believed or protected by their churches. They are abused twice, often with tragic effects. The next chapter will explore those varied effects so churches can better appreciate the damage that can be done if they fail to hold abusive pastors accountable.